Hello and good evening everyone, and welcome to the live reading of Aldous Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy. We've arrived at chapter 6, Mortification, Non-Attachment and Right Livelihood. And for those of you watching this back later on, I just want to say that there'll be no live stream at the weekend. I'm heading off camping, but next weekend I'm going to get back to the novels, the storybooks. As much as I love the Perennial Philosophy, I do miss a nice flowing storybook, a novel. So on Monday I'll be sharing a video of the 4 books that are coming to the poll, and there'll be a poll that coincides with that video, and I'm really looking forward to these 4 books. Are absolute classics, and we'll see what one wins and what one I'll be reading the following Sunday. Hello Green Grapes, good evening. So yeah, that's coming the weekend after next. No live at the weekend, but next weekend it will be an amazing classic book, whatever you guys decide. But as always, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, say hello in the comments, and support over on Patreon, PayPal, or in the super chats. But for now, let's get right into the chapter. Chapter 6, Mortification, Non-Attachment and Right Livelihood. And we begin the chapter right off the bat with a quote from Meister Eckhart. "This treasure of the kingdom of God has been hidden by time and multiplicity and the soul's own works, or briefly by its creaturely nature. But in the measure that the soul can separate itself from this multiplicity, to that extent it reveals within itself the kingdom of God. Here the soul and the Godhead are one." Huxley says, "Our kingdom go is the necessary and unavoidable corollary of thy kingdom come. For the more there is of self, the less there is of God. The divine eternal fullness of life can be gained only by those who have deliberately lost the partial, separative life of craving and self-interest, of egocentric thinking, feeling, wishing and acting. Mortification or deliberate dying to self is inculcated with an uncompromising firmness in the canonical writings of Christianity." Sorry about that, just getting rid of a little spam comment. "Mortification or deliberate dying to self is inculcated with an uncompromising firmness in the canonical writings of Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and most of the other major and minor religions of the world, and by every theocentric saint and spiritual reformer who has ever lived out and expounded the principles of the Perennial Philosophy. But this self-naughting is never, at least by anyone who knows what he is talking about, regarded as an end in itself. It possesses merely an instrumental value as the indispensable means to something else. In the words of one whom we have often had association to cite in earlier sections, it is necessary for all of us to learn the true nature and worth of all self-denials and mortifications." And what follows is a quote from William Law. "As to their nature, considered in themselves, they have nothing of goodness or holiness, nor are any real part of our sanctification. They are not the true food or nourishment of the divine life in our souls. They have no quickening, sanctifying power in them. Their only worth consists in this, that they remove the impediments of holiness, break down that which stands between God and us, and make way for the quickening, sanctifying Spirit of God to operate on our souls, which operation of God is the one only thing that can raise the divine life in the soul, or help it to the smallest degree of real holiness or spiritual life. Hence we may learn the reason why many people not only lose the benefit, but are even the worse for all their mortifications. It is because they mistake the whole nature and worth of them. They practice them for their own sakes, as things good in themselves. They think them to be real parts of holiness, and so rest in them, and look no further, but grow full of self-esteem and self-admiration for their own progress in them. This makes them self-sufficient, morose, severe judges of all those that fall short of their mortifications, and thus their self-denials do only that for them which indulgences do for other people. They withstand and hinder the operation of God upon their souls, and instead of being really self-denials, they strengthen and keep up the kingdom of self. And like I say, that's from William Law. Another quote: "The rout and destruction of the passions, while a good, is not the ultimate good. The discovery of wisdom is the surpassing good. When this is found, all people will sing." And that's from Philo Judea, I think. Another quote: "Living in religion, as I can speak by experience, if one is not in a right course of prayer and other exercises between God and our soul, one's nature groweth much worse than ever it would have been if one had lived in the world. For pride and self-love, which are rooted in the soul by sin, find means to strengthen themselves exceedingly in religion, if the soul is not in a course that may teach her and procure her true humility. For by the corrections and contradictions of the will, which cannot be avoided by any living in a religious community, I find my heart grown, as I may say, as hard as a stone, and nothing would have been able to soften it but by being put into a course of prayer, by which the soul tendeth towards God, and learneth of him the lesson of truly humbling herself." And that quote was from Dame Gertrude Moore. And final quote of this section: "Once, when I was grumbling over being obliged to eat meat and do no penance, I heard it said that sometimes there was more of self-love than desire of penance in such sorrow." And that quote is from St. Teresa. Back to Huxley. "That the mortified are, in some respects, often much worse than the unmortified is a commonplace of history, fiction, and descriptive psychology. Thus the Puritan may practice all the cardinal virtues, prudence, fortitude, temperance, and chastity, and yet remain a thoroughly bad man. For in all too many cases these virtues of his are accompanied by, and indeed casually connected with, the sins of pride, envy, chronic anger, and an uncharitableness pushed sometimes to the level of active cruelty. Mistaking the means for the end, the Puritan has fancied himself holy because he is stoically austere. But stoical austerity is merely the exaltation of the more creditable side of the ego at the expense of the less creditable. Holiness, on the contrary, is the total denial of the separate self in its creditable no less than its discreditable aspects, and the abandonment of the will to God. To the extent that there is attachment to I, me, mine, there is no attachment to, and therefore no unitive knowledge of, the divine ground. Mortification has to be carried to the pitch of non-attachment, or, in the phrase of St. Francois de Sales, holy indifference. Otherwise it merely transfers self-will from one channel to another, not merely without decrease in the total volume of that self-will, but sometimes with an actual increase. As usual, the corruption of the best is the worst. The difference between the mortified but still proud and self-centered Stoic and the unmortified hedonist consists in this: the latter, being flabby, shiftless, and at heart rather ashamed of himself, lacks the energy and the motive to do much harm except to his own body, mind, and spirit. The former, because he has all the secondary virtues and looks down on those who are not like himself, is morally equipped to wish and to be able to do harm on the very largest scale and with a perfectly untroubled conscience. These are obvious facts, and yet, in the current religious jargon of our day, the word immoral is reserved almost exclusively for the carnally self-indulgent. The covetous and the ambitious, the respectable toughs, and those who cloak their lust for power and place under the right sort of idealistic cant, are not merely unblamed, they are even held up as models of virtue and godliness. The representatives of the organized churches begin by putting halos on the heads of the people who do most to make wars and revolutions, then go on rather plaintively to wonder why the world should be in such a mess. Mortification is not, as many people seem to imagine, a matter primarily of severe physical austerities. It is possible that, for certain persons in certain circumstances, the practice of severe physical austerities may prove helpful in advance towards man's final end. In most cases, however, it would seem that what is gained by such austerities is not liberation, but something quite different, the achievement of psychic powers. The ability to get petitionary prayers answered, the power to heal and work other miracles, the knack of looking into the future or into other people's minds, these, it would seem, are often related in some kind of causal connection with fasting, watching, and the self-infliction of pain. Most of the great theocentric saints and spiritual teachers have admitted the existence of supernormal powers, only, however, to deplore them. To think that such siddhis, as the Indians call them, have anything to do with liberation is, they say, a dangerous illusion. These things are either irrelevant to the main issue of life, or, if too much prized and attended to, an obstacle in the way of spiritual advance. Nor are these the only objections to physical austerities. Carried to extremes, they may be dangerous to health, and without health, the steady persistence of effort required by the spiritual life is very difficult of achievement. And being difficult, painful, and generally conspicuous, physical austerities are a standing temptation to vanity and the competitive spirit of record-breaking. When thou didst give thyself up to physical mortification, thou was great, thou was admired. So writes Suso of his experience which led him, just as Gautama Buddha had been led many centuries before, to give up his course of bodily penance. And St. Teresa remarks how much easier it is to impose great penances upon oneself than to suffer in patience, charity, and humbleness the ordinary everyday crosses of family life, which did not prevent her, incidentally, from practicing to the very day of her death the most excruciating forms of self-torture. Whether these austerities really helped her to come to the unitive knowledge of God, or whether they were prized and persisted in because of the psychic powers they helped to develop, there is no means of determining. So in that section, I think it's saying, like, doing the penances, the austerities, with the ego in mind, considering the self, you're almost better off not doing it. Same, I think Jesus says in the gospel that when you give charity, you should do it quietly, silently. And when you pray, don't pray in the marketplace aloud, go into your cupboard. I think he says cupboard or wardrobe or something, and do the prayers quietly. So this is like humility, isn't it? The teachings of humility. Why are you doing the things you're doing? Now we're back to some more quotes. First quote. Our dear Saint Francois de Sales disapproved of immoderate fasting. He used to say that the spirit could not endure the body when overfed, but that, if underfed, the body could not endure the spirit. And that's Jean-Pierre Camus. Another quote. When the will, the moment it feels any joy in sensible things, rises upwards in that joy to God, and when sensible things move it to pray, it should not neglect them. It should make use of them for so holy an exercise, because sensible things in these conditions subserve the end for which God created them, namely to be occasions for making him better known and loved. And that quote's from St. John of the Cross. And here we have another quote from St. John of the Cross. He who is not conscious of liberty of spirit among the things of sense and sweetness, things which should serve as motives to prayer, and whose will rests and feeds upon them, ought to abstain from the use of them, for to him they are a hindrance on the road to God. And another one, like I say, St. John of the Cross, and this one is from St. Jerome, quote, One man may declare that he cannot fast, but can he declare that he cannot love God? Another man may affirm that he cannot preserve virginity or sell all his goods in order to give the price to the poor. But can he tell me that he cannot love his enemies? All that is necessary is to look into one's own heart, for what God asks of us is not found at a great distance. That's from St. Jerome. Back to Huxley for a moment. Anybody who wishes to do so can get all, and indeed more than all, the mortification he wants out of the incidents of ordinary day-to-day living, without ever resorting to harsh bodily penance. And that's what Gurdjieff would say too. Gurdjieff would say, wherever you find the work, wherever the work finds you and you encounter the teachings, that's where you need to practice. You don't need to go into the desert or the monastery or anywhere else for that matter. And like it says here, the mortification he wants out of the incidents of ordinary day-to-day living. So just by living a life, the Buddha would say life is suffering, and these guys seem to agree. Here are the rules laid down by the author of Holy Wisdom for Dame Gertrude Moore. So another quote. First, that she should do all that belonged to her day to... First, that she should do all that belonged to her to do by any law, human or divine. Secondly, that she was to refrain from doing those things that were forbidden her by human or divine law or by divine inspiration. Thirdly, that she should bear with as much patience or resignation as possible all crosses and contradictions to her natural will which were inflicted by the hand of God. Such, for instance, were aridities, temptations, afflictions of bodily pain, sickness and infirmity, or again the loss of friends or want of necessaries and comforts. All this was to be endured patiently, whether the crosses came direct from God or by means of his creatures. These indeed were mortifications enough for Dame Gertrude or for any other soul, and there was no need for anyone to advise or impose others. End quote. That's Augustine Baker. Back to Huxley. To sum up, that mortification is the best which results in the elimination of self-will, self-interest, self-centered thinking, wishing and imagining. Extreme physical austerities are not likely to achieve this kind of mortification, but the acceptance of what happens to us, apart of course from our own sins, in the course of daily living is likely to produce this result. If specific exercises in self-denial are undertaken, they should be inconspicuous, non-competitive and uninjurious to health. Thus, in the matter of diet, most people will find it sufficiently mortifying to refrain from eating all the things which the experts in nutrition condemn as unwholesome. And where social relations are concerned, self-denial should take the form not of showy acts of would-be humility, but of control of the tongue and the moods, in refraining from saying anything uncharitable or merely frivolous, which means in practice refraining from about 50% of ordinary conversation, and in behaving calmly and with quiet cheerfulness when external circumstances or the state of our bodies predisposes us to anxiety, gloom, or an excessive elation. So I like that teaching. That teaching rhymes, like I say, with Gurdjieff, who had a big influence on me, and that is sort of what he would say, but in similar or different words. But I like that very much, that you don't need austerities because day-to-day life is, gives us enough opportunity. More quotes. Quote, when a man practices charity in order to be reborn in heaven or for fame or reward or from fear, such charity can obtain no pure effect. And this is from the Sutra on the Distinction and Protection of the Dharma. Another quote, when Prince Wen Wang was on a tour of inspection in Tsang, he saw an old man fishing. But his fishing was not real fishing, for he did not fish in order to catch fish, but to amuse himself. So Wen Wang wished to employ him in the administration of government, but feared lest his own ministers, uncles and brothers might object. On the other hand, if he let the old man go, he could not bear to think of the people being deprived of such an influence. And that quote's from Chuang Tzu. And this is the final quote for a moment. God, if I worship thee in fear of hell, burn me in hell. And if I worship thee in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship thee for thine own sake, withhold not thine everlasting beauty. And that's from Rabia. And that's beautiful. I like that one as well. Rabia, the Sufi woman saint, speaks, thinks and feels in terms of devotional theism. the Buddhist theologian in terms of impersonal moral law, the Chinese philosopher with characteristic humor in terms of politics. But all three insist on the need for non-attachment to self-interest, insist on it as strongly as does Christ when he reproaches the Pharisees for their egocentric piety, as does the Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita when he tells Arjuna to do his divinely ordained duty without personal craving for or fear of the fruits of his actions. St. Ignatius Loyola was once asked what his feelings would be if the Pope were to suppress the company of Jesus. "A quarter of an hour of prayer," he answered, "and I should think no more about it." This is perhaps the most difficult of all mortifications, to achieve a holy indifference to the temporal success or failure of the cause to which one has devoted one's best energies. If it triumphs, well and good, and if it meets defeat, that also is well and good, if only in ways that, to a limited and time-bound mind, are here and now entirely incomprehensible. More quotes. Quote, "By a man without passions, I mean one who does not permit good or evil to disturb his inward economy, but rather falls in with what happens and does not add to the sum of his mortality." That's a quote from Chuang Tzu. Another quote, "The fitting disposition for union with God is not that the soul should understand, feel, taste, or imagine anything on the subject of the nature of God, or any other thing whatever, but should remain in that pureness and love which is perfect resignation and complete detachment from all things for God alone." And that's from St. John of the Cross. And here we have another quote from St. John of the Cross. Quote, "Disquietude is always vanity, because it serves no good. Yes, even if the whole world were thrown into confusion and all things in it, disquietude on that account would be vanity." Back to Huxley. "Sufficient not only unto the day, but also unto the place is the evil thereof. Agitation over happenings which we are powerless to modify, either because they have not yet occurred, or else are occurring at an inaccessible distance from us, achieves nothing beyond the inoculation of here and now with the remote or anticipated evil that is the object of our distress. Listening 4 or 5 times a day to newscasters and commentators, reading the morning papers and all the weeklies and monthlies nowadays, this is described as taking an intelligent interest in politics. St. John of the Cross would have called it indulgence in idle curiosity and the cultivation of disquietude for disquietude's sake. Quote, "I want very little, and what I do want I have very little wish for. I have hardly any desires, but if I were to be born again, I should have none at all. We should ask nothing and refuse nothing, but leave ourselves in the arms of divine providence, without wasting time in any desire, except to will what God wills of us." End quote, and that's from St. Francois de Sales. Another quote from Lao Tzu. "Push far enough towards the void, hold fast enough to quietness, and of the 10,000 things none can be worked on by you. I have beheld them whither they go back. See all things, howsoever they flourish, return to the root which they grew. This return to the root is called quietness. Quietness is called submission of fate. What has submitted to fate becomes part of the always so. To know the always so is to be illumined. Not to know it means to go blindly to disaster." Lao Tzu. Another quote. "I wish I could join the solitaries on Chaldee Island instead of being superior and having to write books, but I don't wish to have what I wish, of course." End quote, and that's Abbot John Chapman. Another quote. "We must not wish anything other than what happens from moment to moment, all the while, however, exercising ourselves in goodness." End quote, and that's St. Catherine of Genoa. Back to Huxley. "In the practice of mortification, as in most other fields, advance is along a knife edge. On one side lurks the skiller of egocentric austerity, on the other the Charybdis of an uncaring quietism. The holy indifference inculcated by the exponents of the perennial philosophy is neither stoicism nor mere passivity. it is rather an active resignation. Self-will is renounced, not that there may be a total holiday from willing, but that the divine will may use the mortified mind and body as its instrument for good. Or we may say with Kabir that the devout seeker is he who mingles in his heart the double currents of love and detachment, like the mingling of the streams of Ganges and Jumna. Sorry, my browser is closed, so I'll set that back up so I can see what's happening. Until we put an end to particular attachment, there can be no love of God with the whole heart, mind and strength, and no universal charity towards all creatures for God's sake. Hence the hard sayings in the Gospels about the need to renounce exclusively family ties, and if the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, if the Tathagata and the Bodhisattvas have their thoughts awakened to the nature of reality without abiding in anything whatever, this is because a truly godlike love, which, like the sun, shines equally upon the just and the unjust, is impossible to a mind imprisoned in private preferences and aversions. Now we come to some more quotes. Quote, "The soul that is attached to anything, however much good there may be in it, will not arrive at the liberty of divine union. For whether it be a strong wire rope or a slender and delicate thread that holds the bird, it matters not if it really holds it fast, for until the cord be broken, the bird cannot fly. So the soul, held by the bonds of human affections, however slight they may be, cannot, while they last, make its way to God." Wow. And that's St. John of the Cross. Another quote. "There are some who are newly delivered from their sins, and so, though they are resolved to love God, they are still novices and apprentices, soft and weak. They love a number of superfluous, vain and dangerous things at the same time as our Lord. Though they love God above all things, they yet continue to take pleasure in many things which they do not love according to God, but besides him, things such as slight inordinations in word, gesture, clothing, pastimes, and frivolities." And that one's Saint Francois de Sales. Another quote. "There are souls who have made some progress in divine love, and have cut off all the love they had for dangerous things. Yet they still have dangerous and superfluous loves, because they love what God wills them to love, but with excess and to render and passionate a love. The love of our relations, friends, and benefactors is itself according to God, but we may love them excessively, as also our vocations, however spiritual they be, and our devotional exercises, which we should yet love very greatly, may be loved inordinately, when we set them above obedience and the more general good, or care for them as an end, when they are only means." And that one's from Saint Francois de Sales. Another quote. "The goods of God, which are beyond all measure, can only be contained in an empty and solitary heart." That's a quote from St. John of the Cross. We have another quote here from Chuang Tzu. "Suppose a boat is crossing a river and another boat, an empty one, is about to collide with it. Even an irritable man would not lose his temper. But suppose there was someone in the second boat. Then the occupant of the first would shout to him to keep clear, and if he did not hear the first time, nor even when he called to 3 times, bad language would inevitably follow. In the first case there was no anger. In the second there was, because in the first case the boat was empty. In the second it was occupied. And so it is with man. If he could only pass empty through life, who would be able to injure him?" I like that one as well. Chuang Tzu. And the last quote for a moment. "When the heart weeps for what it has lost, the spirit laughs for what it has found." And that's an anonymous Sufi aphorism. Back to Huxley. It is by losing the egocentric life that we save the hitherto latent and undiscovered life which, in the spiritual part of our being, we share with the divine ground. This new-found life is more abundant than the other, and of a different and higher kind. Its possession is liberation into the eternal, and liberation is beatitude. Necessarily so. For the Brahman, who is one with the Atman, is not only being and knowledge, but also bliss, and after love and peace, the final fruit of the spirit is joy. Mortification is painful, but that pain is one of the preconditions of blessedness. This fact of spiritual experience is sometimes obscured by the language in which it is described. Thus, when Christ says that the kingdom of heaven cannot be entered except by those who are as little children, we are apt to forget, so touching are the images evoked by the simple phrase, that a man cannot become childlike unless he chooses to undertake the most strenuous and searching course of self-denial. In practice, the command to become as little children is identical with the command to lose one's life. As Traherne makes clear in the beautiful passage quoted in the section on God in the World, one cannot know created nature in all its essentially sacred beauty unless one first unlearns the dirty devices of adult humanity. Seen through the dung-coloured spectacles of self-interest, the dung-coloured spectacles of self-interest, the universe looks singularly like a dung heap, and, as through long wearing the spectacles have grown onto the eyeballs, the process of cleansing the doors of perception is often, at any rate in the earlier stages of the spiritual life, painfully like a surgical operation. Later on, it is true, even self-naughting may be suffused with the joy of the spirit. On this print, the following passage from the 14th century Scale of Perfection is illuminating. Quote, from Walter Hilton, quote, "Many a man hath the virtues of humility, patience, and charity towards his neighbours, only in the reason and will, and hath no spiritual delight nor love in them. For oft times he feeleth grudging, heaviness, and bitterness for to do them, but yet nevertheless he doth them, but 'tis only by stirring of reason for dread of God. This man hath these virtues in reason and will, but not the love of them in affection. But when, by the grace of Jesus, and by ghostly and bodily exercise, reason is turned into light and will into love, then hath he virtues in affection. For he hath so gnawn on the bitter bark or shell of the nut, that at length he hath broken it, and now feeds on the kernel. That is to say, the virtues which were first heavy for to practice are now turned into a very delight and savour." Like I say, that's Walter Hilton. Another quote, "As long as I am this or that, or have this or that, I am not all things, and I have not all things. Become pure till you neither are nor have either this or that. Then you are omnipresent, and, being neither this nor that, are all things." And that's a quote from Meister Eckhart. Back to Huxley. The point so dramatically emphasized by Eckhart in these lines is one that has often been made the moralists and psychologists of the spiritual life. It is only when we have renounced our preoccupation with I, me, and mine that we can truly possess the world in which we live. Everything is ours, provided that we regard nothing as our property, and not only is everything ours, it is also everybody else's. True love in this differs from dross and clay, that to divide is not to take away. There can be no complete communism except in the goods of the spirit and, to some extent also, of the mind, and only when such goods are possessed by men and women in a state of non-attachment and self-denial. Some degree of mortification, it should be noted, is an indispensable prerequisite for the creation and enjoyment even of merely intellectual and aesthetic goods. Those who choose the profession of artist, philosopher, or man of science choose in many cases a life of poverty and unrewarded hard work. But these are by no means the only mortifications they have to undertake. When he looks at the world, the artist must deny his ordinary human tendency to think of things in utilitarian, self-regarding terms. Similarly, the critical philosopher must mortify his common sense, while the research worker must steadfastly resist the temptations to oversimplify and think conventionally, and must make himself docile to the leadings of mysterious fact. And what is true of the creators of aesthetic and intellectual goods is also true of the enjoyers of such goods when created. That these mortifications are by no means trifling has been shown again and again in the course of history. One thinks, for example, of the intellectually mortified Socrates and the hemlock with which his unmortified compatriots rewarded him. One thinks of the heroic efforts that had to be made by Galileo and his contemporaries to break with the Aristotelian convention of thought, and the no less heroic efforts that have to be made today by any scientist who believes that there is more in the universe than can be discovered by employing the time-hallowed recipes of Descartes. Such mortifications have their reward in a state of consciousness that corresponds on a lower level to spiritual beatitude. The artists and the philosopher and the man of science are also artists, knows the bliss of aesthetic contemplation, discovery, and non-attached possession. The goods of the intellect, the emotions, and the imagination are real goods, but they are not the final good, and when we treat them as ends in themselves, we fall into idolatry. Mortification of will, desire, and action is not enough. There must also be mortification in the fields of knowing, thinking, feeling, and fancying. Another quote: "Man's intellectual faculties are by the fall in a much worse state than his animal appetites, and want a much greater self-denial. And when own will, own understanding, and own imagination have their natural strength indulged and gratified, and are made seemingly rich and honourable with the treasures acquired from a study of the belles letters, they will just as much help poor fallen man to be like-minded with Christ as the art of cookery, well and duly studied, will help a professor of the gospel to the spirit and practice Christian abstinence." End quote, and that's from William Law. Because it was German and spelt with a K, Kultur was an object, during the First World War, of derisive contempt. All this has now been changed. In Russia, literature, art, and science have become the three persons of a new humanistic trinity. Nor is the cult of culture confined to the Soviet Union. It is practiced by a majority of intellectuals in the capitalist democracies. Clever, hard-boiled journalists who write about everything else with the condescending cynicism of people who know all about God, man, and the universe, and have seen through the whole absurd caboodle, fairly fall over themselves when it comes to culture. With an earnestness and enthusiasm that are, in the circumstances, unutterably ludicrous, they invite us to share their positively religious emotions in the face of high art, as represented by the latest murals or civic centres. They insist that so long as Mrs. X goes on writing her inimitable novels and Mr. Y his more than Coleridgean criticism, the world, in spite of all appearances to the contrary, makes sense. The same overvaluation of culture, the same belief that art and literature are ends in themselves and can flourish in isolation from a reasonable and realistic philosophy of life, have even invaded the schools and colleges Among advanced educationists, there are many people who seem to think that all will be well so long as adolescents are permitted to express themselves and small children are encouraged to be creative in the art class. But alas, plasticine and self-expression will not solve the problems of education, nor will technology and vocational guidance, nor the classics and the 100 best books. The following criticisms of education were made more than 2.5 centuries ago, but they are as relevant today as they were in the 17th century. Quote, "He knoweth nothing as he ought to know, who thinks he knoweth anything without seeing its place and the manner how it relateth to God angels and men, and to all the creatures in earth, heaven and hell, time and eternity. And that's a quote from Thomas Traherne. And another quote from Thomas Traherne. Nevertheless, some things were defective too. At Oxford, under the Commonwealth, there was never a tutor that did professly teach felicity, though that be the mistress of all other sciences. Nor did any of us study these things but as aliens, which we ought to have studied as our own enjoyments. We studied to inform our knowledge, but knew not for what end we studied, and for lack of aiming at a certain end, we erred in the manner. That's from Thomas Traherne. In Traherne's vocabulary, felicity means beatitude, which is identical in practice with liberation, which in its turn is the unitive knowledge of God in the heights within and in the fullness without as well as within. What follows is an account of the intellectual mortifications which must be practiced by those whose primary concern is with the knowledge of the Godhead in the interior lights of the soul. And this quote is from the Theologia Germanica. Some men love knowledge and discernment as the best and most excellent of all things. Behold, then, knowledge and discernment come to be loved more than that which is discerned. For false natural light loveth its knowledge and powers, which are itself more than what is known. And were it possible that this false natural light should understand the simple truth as it is in God and in truth, it still would not lose its own property, that is, it could not depart from itself and its own things. Back to Huxley. The relationship between moral action and spiritual knowledge is circular, as it were, and reciprocal. Selfless behavior makes possible an accession of knowledge, and the accession of knowledge makes possible the performance of further and more genuinely selfless actions, which in their turn enhance the agent's capacity for knowing. And so on, if all goes well and there is perfect docility and obedience indefinitely. The process is summed up in a few lines of the Maitreya Upanishad. A man undertakes right action, which includes, of course, right recollectedness and right meditation, and this enables him to catch a glimpse of the self that underlies his separate individuality. Having seen his own self as the self, he becomes selfless, and therefore acts selflessly, and in the virtue of selflessness he is to be conceived as unconditioned. This is the highest mystery, betokening emancipation. Through selflessness he has no part in pleasure or pain. In other words, he enters a state of non-attachment or holy indifference, but achieves absoluteness, or as Albert Magnus phrases it, becomes immutable and arrives at that true life which is God himself. When mortification is perfect, its most characteristic fruit is simplicity. Quote, "A simple heart will love all that is most precious on earth, husband or wife, parent or child, brother or friend, without marring its singleness. External things will have no attraction save inasmuch as they lead souls to him. All exaggeration or unreality, affectation and falsehood must pass away from such a one as the dews dry up before the sunshine. The single motive is to please God, and hence arises total indifference as to what others say and think, so that words and actions are perfectly simple and natural, as in his sight only. Such Christian simplicity is the very perfection of interior life, God, his will and pleasure, its sole object." And that quotes from N. Grau. And here is a more extended account of the matter by one of the greatest masters of psychological analysis. So we have quite a long quote coming up from Fenelon. Quote, like I say, it's a long quote, so. "In the world, when people call anyone simple, they generally mean a foolish, ignorant, credulous person. But real simplicity, so far from being foolish, is almost sublime. All good men like and admire it, are conscious of sinning against it, observe it in others, and know what it involves, and yet they could not precisely define it. I should say that simplicity is an uprightness of soul which prevents self-consciousness. It is not the same as sincerity, which is a much humbler virtue. Many people are sincere who are not simple. They say nothing but what they believe to be true, and do not aim at appearing anything but what they are. But they are forever thinking about themselves, weighing their every word and thought, and dwelling upon themselves in apprehension of having done too much or too little. These people are sincere, but they are not simple. They are not at their ease with others, nor others with them. There is nothing easy, frank, unrestrained, or natural about them. One feels that one would like less admirable people better, who are not so stiff. To be absorbed in the world around and never turn a thought within, as is the blind condition of some who are carried away by what is pleasant and tangible, is one extreme as opposed to simplicity. And to be self-absorbed in all matters, whether it be duty to God or man, is the other extreme, which makes a person wise in his own conceit, reserved, self-conscious, uneasy at the least thing which disturbs his inward self-complacency. Such false wisdom, in spite of its solemnity, is hardly less vain and foolish than the folly of those who plunge headlong into worldly pleasures. The one is intoxicated by his outward surroundings, the other by what he believes himself to be doing inwardly. But both are in a state of intoxication, and the last is a worse state than the first, because it seems to be wise, though it is not really, and so people do not try to be cured. Real simplicity lies in a just milieu, equally free from thoughtlessness and affectation, in which the soul is not overwhelmed by externals so as to be unable to reflect, nor yet given up to the endless refinements which self-consciousness induces. That soul which looks where it is going without losing time arguing over every step or looking back perpetually possesses true simplicity. Such simplicity is indeed a great treasure. How shall we attain to it? I would give all I possess for it. It is the costly pearl of Holy Scripture. The first step, then, is for the soul to put away outward things and look within so as to know its own real interest. So far all is right and natural. Thus much is only a wise self-love, which seeks to avoid the intoxication of the world. In the next step the soul must add the contemplation of God, whom it fears, to that of self. This is a faint approach to the real wisdom, but the soul is still greatly self-absorbed. It is not satisfied with fearing God. It wants to be certain that it does fear him and fears lest it fear him not, going round in a perpetual circle of self-consciousness. All this restless dwelling on self is very far from the peace and freedom of real love, but that is yet in the distance. The soul must needs go through a season of trial, and were it suddenly plunged into a state of rest, it would not know how to use it. The third step is that, ceasing from a restless self-contemplation, the soul begins to dwell upon God instead, and by degrees forgets itself in him. It becomes full of him and ceases to feed upon self. Such a soul is not blinded to its own faults or indifferent to its own errors. It is more conscious of them than ever, and increased light shows them in plainer form. But this self-knowledge comes from God, and therefore it is not restless or uneasy. And that long quote was from Fenelon. Back to Huxley. How admirably acute and subtle this is! One of the most extraordinary, because gratuitous, pieces of 20th century vanity is the assumption that nobody knew anything about psychology before the days of Freud. But the real truth is that most modern psychologists understand human beings less well than did the ablest of their predecessors. Fenelon and La Rochefoucauld knew all about the surface rationalization of deep, discreditable motives in the subconscious, and were fully aware that sexuality and the will to power were all too often the effective forces at work under the polite mask of the persona. Machiavelli had drawn Pareto's distinction between residues and derivations, between the real, self-interested motives for political action and the fancy, theories, principles, and ideals in terms of which such action is explained and justified to the credulous public. Like Buddha's and St. Augustine's, Pascal's view of human virtue and rationality could not have been more realistically low. But all these men, even La Rochefoucauld, even Machiavelli, were aware of certain facts which 20th century psychologists have chosen to ignore. The fact that human nature is tripartite, consisting of a spirit as well as of a mind and a body. The fact that we live on the borderline between two worlds, the temporal and the eternal, the physical vital human and the divine. The fact that, though nothing in himself, man is a nothing surrounded by God, indigent of God, capable of God, and filled with God, if he so desires. The Christian simplicity of which Grau and Fenelon write is the same thing as the virtue so much admired by Lao Tzu and his successors. According to these Chinese sages, personal sins and social maladjustments are all due to the fact that men have separated themselves from their divine source and live according to their own will and notions, not according to Tao, which is the great way, the Logos, the nature of things, as it manifests itself on every plane, from the physical up through the animal and the mental to the spiritual. Enlightenment comes when we give up self-will and make ourselves docile to the workings of Tao in the world around us and in our own bodies, minds and spirits. Sometimes the Taoist philosophers write as though they believed in Rousseau's noble savage, and, being Chinese and therefore much more concerned with the concrete and the practical than with the merely speculative, they are fond of prescribing methods by which rulers may reduce the complexity of civilization and so preserve their subjects from the corrupting influences of man-made and therefore Tao-eclipsing conventions of thought, feeling and action. But the rulers who are to perform this task for the masses must themselves be sages, and to become a sage one must get rid of all the rigidities of unregenerate adulthood and become again as a little child, for only that which is soft and docile is truly alive. That which conquers and outlives everything is that which adapts itself to everything, that which always seeks the lowest place, not the hard rock, but the water that wears away the everlasting hills. The simplicity and spontaneity of the perfect sage are the fruits of mortification, mortification of the will and by recollectedness and meditation of the mind. Only the most highly disciplined artist can recapture on a higher level the spontaneity of the child with its first paint box. Nothing is more difficult than to be simple. Hello, Joanne. Nice to see you. I hope you're doing well. Don't worry about that. I think we would all like some enlightenment, Joanne. If only it was that easy, eh? We come to another quote, a quote from Chuang-Tzu. May I ask, said Yen Hui, in what consists the fasting of the heart? Cultivate unity, replied Confucius. You do your hearing not with your ears, but with your mind. Not with your mind, but with your very soul. But let the hearing stop with the ears. Let the working of the mind stop with itself. Then the soul will be a negative existence, passively responsive to externals. In such a negative existence, only Tao can abide, and that negative state is the fasting of the heart. Then, said Yen Hui, the reason I could not get the use of this method is my own individuality. If I could get the use of it, my individuality would have gone. Is this what you mean by the negative state? Exactly so, replied the master. Let me tell you, if you can enter the domain of this prince, a bad ruler whom Yen Hui was ambitious to reform, without offending his amour propre, cheerful if he hears you, passive if he does not, without science, without drugs, simply living there in a state of complete indifference, you will be near success. Look at that window. Through it an empty room becomes bright with scenery, but the landscape stops outside. In this sense, you may use your ears and eyes to communicate within, but shut out all wisdom in the sense of conventional copybook maxims from your mind. This is the method for regenerating all creation. And that's from Chuang-Tzu. I'm not sure who I would say has contributed the most. I think the man who I would say has popularized it the most, so you could argue contributed the most, would be, yeah, Aldous Huxley, because when you think of the perennial philosophy, many people think of Aldous Huxley, so I think he's a good person to go to. But yeah, if you go back to the introduction, Haroon, go back and listen to the introduction and you'll hear a lot more of the contributors. Back to Huxley. Mortification may be regarded in this context as the process of study, by which we learn at last to have unstudied reactions to events, reactions in harmony with Tao, suchness, the will of God. Those who have made themselves docile to the divine nature of things, those who respond to circumstances, not with craving and aversion, but with love that permits them to do spontaneously what they like. Those who can truthfully say, not I, but God in me. Such men and women are compared by the exponents of the perennial philosophy to children, to fools and simpletons, even sometimes, as in the following passage, to drunkards. Quote, a drunken man who falls out of a cart, though he may suffer, does not die. His bones are the same as other people's, but he meets his accident in a different way. His spirit is in a condition of security. He is not conscious of riding in the cart, neither is he conscious of falling out of it. Ideas of life, death, fear, and the like cannot penetrate his breast, and so he does not suffer from contact with objective existence. If such security is to be got from wine, how much more is it to be got from God? And that's Chuang Tzu. We've got a few quotes here from Chuang Tzu, and I quite like that, because as a young man I would drink quite a lot, and I would feel like that, I suppose, nothing would worry you. I think he's mentioned in the introduction, Haroon, that gentleman, Shuon. So yes, he's definitely part of the gang. Back to Huxley. It is by long obedience and hard work that the artist comes to unforced spontaneity and consummate mastery, knowing that he can never create anything on his own account. Out of the top layers, so to speak, of his personal consciousness, he submits obediently to the workings of inspiration, and knowing that the medium in which he works has its own self-nature, which must not be ignored, in which he works has its own self-nature, which must not be ignored or violently overridden. He makes himself its patient servant and, in this way, achieves perfect freedom of expression. But life is also an art, and the man who would become a consummate artist in living must follow on all the levels of his being the same procedure as that by which the painter or the sculptor or any other craftsman comes to his own more limited perfection. And here we have another quote from Chuang Tzu. Prince He's cook was cutting up a bullock. Every blow of his knife, every heave of his shoulders, every thread of his foot, every whoosh of rent flesh, every chuck of the chopper was in perfect harmony, rhythmical like the dance of the mulberry grove, simultaneous like the chords of the Ching Shu. Well done, cried the prince, yours is skill indeed. Sire, replied the cook, I have always devoted myself to Tao. It is better than skill. When I first began to cut up bullocks, I saw before me simply whole bullocks. After 3 years' practice, I saw no more whole animals. And now I work with my mind and not with my eye. When my senses bid me stop, but my mind urges me on, I fall back upon eternal principles. I follow such openings or cavities as there may be, according to the natural constitution of the animal. I do not attempt to cut through joints, still less through large bones. A good cook changes his chopper once a year because he cuts, an ordinary cook once a month because he hacks. But I have had this chopper 19 years, and though I have cut up many thousands of bullocks, its edge is as fresh from the whetstone. For at the joints there are always interstices, and the edge of a chopper being without thickness, it remains only to insert that which is without thickness into such an interstice. By these means the interstice will be enlarged, and the blade will find plenty of room. It is thus that I have kept my chopper for 19 years, as though fresh from the whetstone. Nevertheless, when I come upon a hard part, where the blade meets with a difficulty, I am all caution. I fix my eyes on it. I stay my hand and gently apply the blade, until with a whaw the part yields like earth crumbling to the ground. Then I withdraw the blade and stand up and look around, and at last I wipe my chopper and put it carefully away. "Bravo!" cried the prince. "From the words of this cook I have learnt how to take care of my life." And again, that's from Chuang Tzu. Back to Huxley. In the first 7 branches of his eightfold path, the Buddha describes the conditions that must be fulfilled by anyone who desires to come to that right contemplation, which is the 8th and final branch. The fulfillment of these conditions entails the undertaking of a course of the most searching and comprehensive mortification. Mortification of intellect and will, craving and emotion, thought, speech, action, and finally means of livelihood. Excuse me. Certain professions are more or less completely incompatible with the achievement of man's final end, and there are certain ways of making a living which do so much physical and above all so much moral, intellectual and spiritual harm that even if they could be practiced in a non-attached spirit, which is generally impossible, they would still have to be eschewed by anyone dedicated to the task of liberating not only himself but others. The exponents of the Perennial Philosophy are not content to avoid and forbid the practice of criminal professions such as brothel-keeping, forgery, racketeering and the like. They also avoid themselves and warn others against a number of ways of livelihood commonly regarded as legitimate. Thus, in many Buddhist societies, the manufacture of arms, the concoction of intoxicating liquors, and the wholesale purveying of butcher's meat were not, as in contemporary Christendom, rewarded by wealth, peerages, and political influence. They were deplored as businesses which, it was thought, made it particularly difficult for their practitioners and for other members of the communities in which they were practiced to achieve enlightenment and liberation. Similarly, in medieval Europe, Christians were forbidden to make a living by the taking of interest on money or by cornering the market. As Tawney and others have shown, it was only after the Reformation that coupon clipping, usury and gambling in stocks and commodities became respectable and received ecclesiastical approval. I like the long words too, Joanne. And sometimes I find I tell my children when they're reading, and even for myself when I first started reading, sometimes you've got to just browse over a long word, because something like Huxley's so intelligent and intellectual and has such a wide grasp and usage of the English language. If you were reading it and you know, every time you came to a word you didn't understand, you got your dictionary, you wouldn't get very far. You'd be reading a page a day. So sometimes I find if you just browse over or breeze over, I don't know what the right word is, breeze over a word and just take the general gist of the sentence, you can sort of get enough from it. Unless, of course, there's 3 or 4 long words in a sentence and then, just miss that sentence out. For the Quakers, soldiering was and is a form of wrong livelihood, war being in their eyes anti-Christian, not so much because it causes suffering as because it propagates hatred, puts a premium on fraud and cruelty, infects whole societies with anger, fear, pride and uncharitableness. Such passions eclipse the inner light, and therefore the wars by which they are aroused and intensified must be regarded, whatever their immediate political outcome, as crusades to make the world safe for spiritual darkness. It has been found as a matter of experience that it is dangerous to lay down detailed and inflexible rules for right livelihood, dangerous because most people see no reason for being righteous overmuch and consequently respond to the imposition of too rigid a code by hypocrisy or open rebellion. In the Christian tradition, for example, a distinction is made between the precepts which are binding on all and sundry, and the counsels of perfection, binding only upon those who feel drawn towards a total renunciation of the world. The precepts include the ordinary moral code and the commandment to love God with all one's heart, strength and mind, and one's neighbour as oneself. Some of those who make a serious effort to obey this last and greatest commandment find that they cannot do so wholeheartedly unless they follow the counsels and sever all connections with the world. Nevertheless, it is possible for men and women to achieve that perfection which is deliverance into the unitive knowledge of God without abandoning the married state and without selling all they have and giving the price to the poor. Effective poverty, possessing no money, is by no means always effective poverty, being indifferent to money. That's very interesting, isn't it? Effective poverty, so having no money, is by no means always effective poverty, being indifferent to money. One man may be poor but desperately concerned with what money can buy, full of cravings, envy and bitter self-pity. Another may have money, but no attachment to money, or the things, powers and privileges that money can buy. Evangelical poverty is a combination of effective with affective poverty, but a genuine poverty of spirit is possible even in those who are not effectively poor. It will be seen then that the problems of right livelihood, insofar as they lie outside the jurisdiction of the common moral code, are strictly personal. The way in which any individual problem represents itself and the nature of the appropriate solution depend upon the degree of knowledge, moral sensibility, and spiritual insight achieved by the individual concerned. For this reason, no universally applicable rules can be formulated except in the most general terms. Here are my 3 treasures, says Lao Tzu, guard and keep them. The first is pity, the second frugality, the third refusal to be foremost of all things under heaven. And when Jesus is asked by a stranger to settle a dispute between himself and his brother over an inheritance, he refuses, since he does not know the circumstances, to be a judge in the case, and merely utters general warning against covetousness. I'm sorry to hear that, Joanne. I'd recommend listening to the Bhagavad Gita as well as the Perennial Philosophy. The Bhagavad Gita has a lot of spiritual guidance that might be able to help, and just some meditation and prayer I think also can help. So, and like you've even said yourself before, I think on one of the streams, talking to people as well. So yeah, I'll be thinking of you and wish you all the best. Now we come to a quote from 101 Zen Stories. Ga-san instructed his adherents one day, "Those who speak against killing and who desire to spare the lives of all conscious beings are right. It is good to protect even animals and insects. But what about those persons who kill time? What about those who destroy wealth and those who murder the economy of their society? We should not overlook them. Again, what of one who preaches without enlightenment? He is killing Buddhism." That's a good one, from 101 Zen Stories. And another quote from Jalaluddin Rumi. Once the noble Ibrahim, as he sat on his throne, heard a clamour and noise of cries on the roof, also heavy footsteps on the roof of his palace. He said to himself, "Whose heavy feet are these?" He shouted from the window, "Who goes there?" The guards, filled with confusion, bowed their heads, saying, "It is we, going the rounds in search." He said, "What seek ye?" They said, "Our camels." He said, "Who ever searched for camels on a housetop?" They said, "We follow thy example." "Who seekest union with God while sitting on a throne?" And like I said, that's Jalaluddin Rumi. Back to Huxley. Of all social, moral and spiritual problems, that of power is the most chronically urgent and the most difficult of solution. Craving for power is not a vice of the body, consequently knows none of the limitation imposed by a tired or satiated physiology upon gluttony, intemperance, and lust. Growing with every successive satisfaction, the appetite for power can manifest itself indefinitely, without interruption by bodily fatigue or sickness. Moreover, the nature of society is such that the higher a man climbs in the political, economic, or religious hierarchy, the greater are his opportunities and resources for exercising power. By climbing the hierarchical ladder is ordinarily a slow process, and the ambitious rarely reach the top till they are well advanced in life. The older he grows, the more chances does the power lover have for indulging his besetting sin. The more continuously is he subjected to temptations, and the more glamorous do those temptations become. In this respect, his situation is profoundly different from that of the debauchee. The latter may never voluntarily leave his vices, but at least, as he advances in years, he finds his vices leaving him. The former neither leaves his vices nor is left by them. Instead of bringing to the power lover a merciful respite from his addictions, old age is apt to intensify them by making it easier for him to satisfy his cravings on a larger scale and in a more spectacular way. That is why, in Acton's words, all great men are bad. Can we therefore be surprised if political action undertaken, in all too many cases not for the public good, but solely or at least primarily to gratify the power lusts of bad men, should prove so often either self-stultifying or downright disastrous? L'état c'est moi, says the tyrant, and this is true, of course, not only of the autocrat at the apex of the pyramid, but of all the members of the ruling minority through whom he governs, and who are, in fact, the real rulers of the nation. Moreover, so long as the policy which gratifies the power lusts of ruling class is successful, and so long as the price of success is not too high, even the masses of the ruled will feel the state in themselves a vast and splendid projection of the individual's intrinsically insignificant ego. The little man can satisfy his lust for power vicariously through the activities of the imperialistic state, just as the big man does. The difference between them is one of degree, not of kind. No infallible method for controlling the political manifestations of the lust for power has ever been devised. Since power is of its very essence indefinitely expansive, it cannot be checked except by colliding with another power. Hence, any society that values liberty, in the sense of government by law rather than by class interest or personal decree, must see to it that the power of its rulers is divided. National unity means national servitude to a single man and his supporting oligarchy. Organized and balanced disunity is the necessary condition of liberty. His Majesty's loyal opposition is the loyalist, because the most genuinely useful section of any liberty-loving community. Furthermore, since the appetite for power is purely mental, and therefore insatiable and impervious to disease or old age, no community that values liberty can afford to give its rulers long tenures of office. The Carthusian order, which was never reformed because never deformed, owed its long immunity from corruption to the fact that its abbots were elected for periods of only a single year. In ancient Rome, the amount of liberty under law was in inverse ratio to the length of the magistrate's term of office. These rules for controlling the lust for power are very easy to formulate, but very difficult, as history shows, to enforce in practice. They are particularly difficult to enforce at a period like the present, when time-hallowed political machinery is being rendered obsolete by rapid technological change, and when the salutary principle of organized and balanced disunity requires to be embodied in new and more appropriate institutions. Acton, the learned Catholic historian, Acton, the learned Catholic historian, was of opinion that all great men are bad, Rumi, the Persian poet and mystic, thought that to seek for union with God while occupying a throne was an undertaking hardly less senseless than looking for camels among the chimney pots. A slightly more optimistic note is sounded by Saint Francois de Sales, whose views on the matter we recorded by his Boswellizing disciple, the young Bishop of Bely. A quote from Jean-Pierre Camus coming up, quote, "Mon père," I said one day, "how is it possible for those who are themselves high in office to practice the virtue of obedience?" Francois de Sales replied, "They have greater and more excellent ways of doing so than their inferiors." As I did not understand this reply, he went on to say, "Those who are bound by obedience are usually subject to the superior only. But those who are themselves superiors have a wider field for obedience, even while they command. For if they bear in mind that it is God who has placed them over other men and gives them the rule they have, they will exercise it out of obedience to God, and thus, even while commanding, they will obey. Moreover, there is no position so high but that it is subject to a spiritual superior in what concerns the conscience and the soul. But there is a yet higher point of obedience to which all superiors may aspire, even that to which St. Paul alludes when he says, 'Though I be free from all men, yet I have made myself servant unto all.' It is by such universal obedience to everyone that we become all things to all men, and serving everyone for our Lord's sake, we esteem all to be our superiors. In accordance with this rule, I have often observed how Francois de Sales treated everyone, even the most insignificant person who approached him, as though he were the inferior, never repulsing anyone, never refusing to enter into conversation, to speak or to listen, never betraying the slightest sign of weariness, impatience, and annoyance, however importunate or ill-timed the interruption. To those who asked him why he thus wasted his time, his constant reply was, 'It is God's will. It is what he requires of me. What more need I ask? While I am doing this, I am not required to do anything else. God's holy will is the centre from which all we must do radiate. All else is mere weariness and excitement." End quote. That's Jean-Pierre Camus. We see then that a great man can be good enough even to aspire to unitive knowledge of the divine ground, provided that, while exercising power, he fulfills two conditions. First, he must deny himself all the personal advantages of power, and must practice the patience and recollectedness without which there cannot be love either of man or God. And second, he must realize that the accident of possessing temporal power does not give him spiritual authority, which belongs only to those seers, living or dead, who have achieved a direct insight into the nature of things. A society in which the boss is mad enough to believe himself a prophet is a society doomed to destruction. A viable society is one in which those who have qualified themselves to see indicate the goals to be aimed at, while those whose business is to rule respect the authority and listen to the advice of the seers. In theory, at least, all this was well understood in India and until the Reformation in Europe, where no position was so high but that it was subject to a spiritual superior in what concerned the conscience and the soul. Unfortunately, the churches tried to make the best of both worlds, to combine spiritual authority with temporal power, wielded either directly or at one remove from behind the throne. But spiritual authority can be exercised only by those who are perfectly disinterested and whose motives are therefore above suspicion. An ecclesiastical organization may call itself the mystical body of Christ, but if its prelates are slaveholders and the rulers of states as they were in the past, or if the corporation is a large-scale capitalist, as is the case today, no titles, however honorific, can conceal the fact that, when it passes judgment, it does so as an interested party with some political or economic axe to grind. True, in matters which do not directly concern the temporal powers of the corporation, individual churchmen can be, and have actually proved themselves, perfectly disinterested, consequently can possess and have possessed genuine spiritual authority. St. Philip Neyres is a case in point. Possessing absolutely no temporal power, he yet exercised a prodigious influence over 16th century Europe. But for that influence it may be doubted whether the efforts of the Council of Trent to reform the Roman Church from within, would have met with much success. In actual practice, how many great men have ever fulfilled, or are ever likely to fulfill, the conditions which alone render power innocuous to the ruler as well as to the ruled? Obviously very few. Except by saints, the problem of power is finally insoluble. But since genuine self-government is possible only in very small groups, societies on a national or supranational scale will always be ruled by oligarchical minorities whose members come to power because they have a lust for power. This means that the problem of power will always arise, and, since it cannot be solved except by people like Francois de Sales, will always make trouble. And this, in its turn, means that we cannot expect the large-scale societies of the future to be much better than were the societies of the past during the brief periods when they were at their best. And guys, that's the end of chapter 6, and the next chapter 7 will be truth. So a very interesting chapter on truth, and that will be coming up on Monday evening. There'll be no live reads over the weekend because I said I'm away camping. I'm looking forward to that, but I'll be back for Monday evening at 9 to read chapter 7. And also, I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, but I'll say it again, next Sunday we'll be having a novel, going back to like books. We'll take a break from the Perennial Philosophy. I won't stop, I'm going to carry on, but I'll be reading the Perennial Philosophy during the week. And at the weekends, we'll be going back to the polls and the books that you guys want to hear. So I'm very excited for that. Keep an eye out on Monday, because I'll be sharing a video with the books that are going into the polls, and there'll be a poll to accompany that. So for now, guys, have a lovely weekend. Thanks for joining me. And I'm looking forward to sharing that video with all the cool books that you'll be able to choose from in the polls. So guys, take care, have a lovely weekend, and I'll see you Monday night at 9. All right guys, take care, see you, bye bye.